language and in other languages, and I found out there is no such a thing. You cannot translate it, which sort of pushed me back in terms of how this category came about in the context of Western culture, Western society. And I found out that actually to understand this category, you have to have a relationship between an individual and the state, between an individual and the society. It's the society that recognizes that you're different and that because of your difference, you need to be included or excluded, or you need to have some kind of special treatment in terms of education, or you need to be compensated and so forth. And so to a certain extent, you could say, oh, in that society, what we understand as disability does not exist. And so it's almost like we are coming from the outside, and then we are going to introduce a new category into the culture. So I was trying to work around that. And so I was asking naive questions in terms of, for example, one of the questions that I tried to come out, that if you see a child that is born deformed, that is not the expectation that you have, as that the expectation is that a healthy, complete child is being born. And so then they would say that, well, and they were reflecting, so this is in the 1980s, and people were reflecting about both indigenous culture, and they were also reflecting as the result of colonialism. So the answer to the question was twofold. On the one hand, they would say, oh, this is a sort of disorder that is being created. And because there is a disorder, then this would go beyond the family units. Other people would come in, and they would start to investigate. They would start to investigate, and a lot of attention would be drawn upon the mother, but also on the father in terms of how could this happen? Why is this happening? And so one of the solutions to this would be, and I think this is the already reflection of the culture as a result of colonialism, is that people would be fined. You would get a fine because you're creating havoc. You're creating disorder in the society. So in this area where we were, it had a history of cotton producing, the production of cotton. So the colonizer would impose the growing of cotton. If you create disorder, then you would be punished for this. You would be fined for this. And similarly, if you create this kind of disorder by bringing a disabled child in the community, that would be resulting in a fine. So here you already see that the colonial framework is sort of getting into, the understanding of the situations of people. The other one, and I would consider that to be an indigenous response. The other one that was told to me was that people would say that a disabled, deformed child being born in a family, would sort of be sanctioned in terms of this child cannot survive. This child actually needs to be actively killed. And so the way that was happening was that it was ritualized. And you have to understand a lot of things, to understand what is going on. On the one hand, they would say, what you do is you find a small white chicken, and that chicken is going to be killed. And that chicken is going to be tied around the neck or the ankle of the child. And someone from the community will take the child with this chicken tied to it and will go to a river and will throw this child into the river with sort of prayers or sort of sayings to God in terms of, God, you sent us a bad child. Send us a better child. We don't accept this child. Send us a better child. And you have to understand that actually you can understand this. This is how I also analyzed it. You can understand this as killing. You know, there were other kind of directions saying, if you go, the person that goes with this child should not look back. You should go definite and do this, okay? Because it's a relationship with God, and so the people actually believed in reincarnation. So on the one hand, you have with the killing of this white chicken, you have a sort of ritual that is appeasing the spirit of that child, is recognizing the spirit of that child, and so the child could not be buried in ordinary ground because that would be polluting the ground. You know, the child had to be actually thrown in the river so it could actually come back. So there is a belief in reincarnation that this child can be coming back. So the colonizer got sort of knew that this kind of practices were happening. They did not have the full understanding of this, and they were just looking at the law, and they were actually considering this not to be mere killing, but to be murder, which had to be tried in the courts. So there are court cases of this that, you know, so you have multiple cultural logics already going on there. You know, so the point that I actually want to make is that it's not one cultural logic, it's multiple cultural logics. You know, it's and, it's not one or the other. It's not that the colonial framework actually replaced the indigenous framework. So it's multiple frameworks that are at work. So fast forward, the last time that I was in Congo, I had a lot of discussions about artificial intelligence. So it's not like people are not aware in terms of what is going in the world. And so we have multiple crises. We have epistemological crisis in terms of what can we know. We have ecological crisis and so forth. And so in terms of our own understanding, we think that the category of the human needs to be revitalized. We understand that the category of the human needs to be expanded. We sort of become aware that the category of the human in terms of the modern human needs to be surpassed, and we need to develop into something else. And so therefore we need a sort of new beginning, a renewal of our humanity. And the solution is not one or the other, but a very careful navigation and in many cases a sort of trade-off in terms of, okay, if we cross this boundary, then what are going to be the ethical implications of this? And so, but definitely I think we need a decentering of the human. In terms, we have become aware that with the ecological crisis, that the human has destroyed a lot, and that we need a decentering. We need to make place for other entities, non-human and other living entities. And so I'm going to start to stop here as a sort of, you know, setting the stage. And I would like, we'll see how many rounds we can do, but I would like to give a first round, develop a sort of first round of responses and their own interpretations. And in Belgium already we sort of tried this out, and we had a first round, and I was asking everybody, you know, I sort of give you a perspective from my work as an anthropologist to try to figure out certain things. You know, could you give a perspective from your own discipline? And So the first person that I would like to come in is Professor Koen Devriendt, who is a geneticist at KU Leuven and is also involved in clinical work, is doing consultations with people, and is advising and is also, providing and allowing technology to come in. So I'll ask him to give his perspective.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. So thank you very much for this invitation to participate in this very interesting but also challenging roundtable. So as Patrick said, I'm a clinical geneticist. I'm a medical doctor, and in our center, in my consultations, I meet many families with a child with a disability, with typically a developmental disorder. So the view I have is really starting from a medical biological point of view. So people come to us with their children with a disability, and the questions are, okay, what does my child have? What are the prospects of my child, and what will happen with my child in the near future, on the long term? How did it happen? And also, well, if you want another child, will it happen again? Or what is the risk, and what does it mean for other family members? And one of the entry points is genetics. And over the last few decades, we have seen a tremendous increase in knowledge of genetics. And just to give you an idea, very well already nowadays, we can actually we can sequence all the genes in our genome for just a few €100. And very soon we will sequence the entire genome, meaning all your DNA of any person, for like €100. And this technology, on the one hand, allowed to do very detailed studies in individuals with unexplained developmental disorders. And our knowledge on genetics of developmental disorders has increased dramatically, and still is ongoing. And I probably don't exaggerate that when I say that every week new genes are discovered that are linked to a specific disorder, and this is ongoing. So we have, on the one hand, increasing knowledge, and on the other hand, we have technology that allows us to use this in a clinical setting. So when families come to us with their child, with the question, okay, what does my child have? Genetic testing is really getting one of the first line tests, because it has such a huge potential of reaching what we call a diagnosis. For instance, in children with an unexplained complex and severe disorder, with the current genetic testing, we reach a diagnosis in about 40%. If I go back when I started in genetics, this was just a few percent. So the progress is really very impressive. But then the question is, what does it mean, reaching a diagnosis? And traditionally in medicine, we translate this into the utility. What does it mean for the patient? What does it mean for the family? And on the one hand, we talk about medical utility. Medical meaning, how can we actually inform people about the prognosis of this child? Do we have to focus on specific risks during when the child grows up? How will puberty happen? Do we need to do additional investigations, for instance, of the heart or the kidneys? And perhaps and this is also increasing, but I think Roel will talk about this later, maybe new treatments as well. But this is the traditional medical point of view. But what we have witnessed is that there is also a personal utility. For many parents, knowing what their child has, even if it has no immediate medical consequences, can be very important. And one aspect that we notice almost always is guilt relief. If we do not come up with an explanation, people start looking somewhere and always blame someone, and typically themselves, and very often mothers, because they have been carrying the child for 9 months, and anything that happened during pregnancy is interpreted as, well, this may have caused the problem in my child. So even if the parents do not actually voice this idea of guilt, in my consultation, I always try to raise the question. And I say, well, now we have an explanation. What did you think caused the problem? And then this comes up. And it's a tremendous relief for parents to know that they are not to blame. We all carry, each human being at birth carries 60 new changes in his DNA. We all do. But some people are very unlucky that one of these changes got into a wrong place and caused a disorder. Also, knowing that what is the cause is like stopping what we often call the diagnostic odyssey. A repetitive number of tests are done that are often very expensive and not very pleasant for the child. Well, we can stop doing this. People get rest. And it also offers them the possibility to join patient groups. We see more and more that parents of children with a specific genetic disorder or syndrome, they try to find each other, often on Facebook, to exchange experiences. And this peer-to-peer support is extremely important, and this surpasses anything we can offer them in the medical community. And I think this is very, very valuable. But obviously, I've also been working in Kinshasa, as Patrick did, but more recently. And obviously, this personal utility is very, very much depending on the local cultural environment, religious environment, also the socio-economic possibilities. And studies on this are only very, very slowly starting to appear in Europe, the United States, but almost none in Africa. So there remains a lot of work to be done in that topic. So this is one part of the work I'm doing, clinical service, and this is really individual centered. So we're dealing with the child and his family. But genetics also offers the opportunity for screening. Screening meaning that not just responding to individual questions, but looking at a population wide scale. There are a number of situations where screening is actually starting to come up or has already started. For instance, the non-invasive prenatal testing, and I'll get into detail about this a bit later, but also the preconception carrier testing, which offers the opportunity for couples to know whether they have an increased risk for a genetic disorder in their child. And very soon we will also see the introduction of neonatal genetic screening for severe pediatric disorders that are one way or the other treatable, but also in adults, the option to get screened for genetic disorders with late onset, and then we talk about cancer, heart disease, etc. But let's take the NIPT, or non-invasive prenatal testing as an example. So this is a very reliable test that offers the detection for some chromosomal abnormalities, like Down syndrome, trisomy 13/18, based on a simple blood sample in the mother at the end of the first trimester. Yeah. And it's very reliable in the sense that the false negative of this test is very, very low. Like for Down syndrome, it's maybe between 1 and 2%. So it's a very reliable test. And in Belgium, this test is reimbursed for all pregnant women. Yeah. The uptake is about 80%. But obviously we have questions about this. And one of the questions is, how well are pregnant women and their partners informed about the tests? Yeah. Do they know what Down syndrome means? Yeah. And from a society point of view, we can ask ourselves, why is Down syndrome singled out as a disorder to detect? So many other disorders. Yeah. So what information do expecting parents obtain? Where do they get the information? Yeah. Isn't there a risk that this test is just routinely added to the other tests that are offered during pregnancy? Yeah. And what if the fetus has trisomy 21? The experience is that the overwhelming majority of parents opt for termination of pregnancy. So this is screening, yeah, and obviously this is a completely different situation than where parents come with a child with a disability. Yeah, this has impact on the population, and whether it reflects or not the vision of a population on disabilities, this is the question. And there hasn't been a real public debate about this before the introduction and reimbursement of the test. But the test goes even further. Yeah, since we look at all the chromosomes, we can also detect certain chromosomal abnormalities with much less severe consequences. And I take the example of Klinefelter. And Klinefelter it's a disorder of the sex chromosomes. These are men who carry, instead of the X and the Y chromosome, 2 X chromosomes and a Y chromosome. And the NIPT can reliably detect this. Yeah. The condition occurs in about 1 in 1,000 men. Yeah. And if we look at the statistics in the population, well, ultimately about only 30% of these men are ultimately diagnosed with the disorder. Why? Because many of them do not have major problems. Yeah. The main issue is that they may have some learning problems, but typically have normal education career. There may be some social emotional problems, but the main medical complication is that these men are always infertile. So most of them actually present as adults when they wish to have a child. So is this something that we should screen for antenatally? We had this discussion in Leuven, and there we decided not to include this in the test. We do not feel that as a population we should screen for a condition which is compatible with a normal life, albeit with some issues. However, this vision is not shared by all the genetic centers. So we end up with a situation that in some centers, depending on the doctor you see, you can choose to have this tested or you can't. And this is creating, obviously, a very strange situation. Yeah. Just recently, one of my colleagues met a couple. She was pregnant. Her husband had Klinefelter. Yeah. And so they became pregnant after donor sperm. They were very happy about this. The NIPT was discussed, and the doctor very hesitantly discussed the possibility of also testing for Klinefelter. And the man reacted and said, well, doctor, do you mean that I should not be here? Just illustrating that we are dealing with people. Huh? It's a chromosomal abnormality, but the impact is not severe at all. The second test is what we call preconception carrier testing. So couples who want to have a child, they have the option to get a test where they are tested if they are both carrier for a disorder which is associated with the risk of 25% for their child. Yeah. However, this test is not reimbursed and costs currently 1,500 euros, which is a huge amount of money. Most couples cannot afford this. And obviously this raises important questions about free choice and unequal access to medicine in our country. I think these are just some of the reflections I would like to propose to you.
Thank you, Koen, for your intervention. So we started in this panel. I explained the difference between an indigenous and a colonial cultural logic, and I think Koen, you reflected a little bit on the evolving cultural logic in a country like Belgium, where certain, especially when it comes to screening, that screening, screening with a non-invasive pregnancy test becomes part of the cultural logic of people in Belgium, that it's taken up and that the consequence of that will be an abortion, which is basically also killing. It's the killing of certain types, and then you manage that certain will be killed and others will not be killed, and you give the example of the Klinefelter syndrome as one that, and then you also mentioned that other tests will not be taken, and to complicate even things further, genetic centers and we had this discussion when we were in Belgium, that there will be differences between different genetic test centers in Belgium, even in Flanders, that at our university, certain things will not be screened because of certain understandings of the condition and will also not be given information about. And while in other centers, this is actually going to happen. And it will be, certain conditions will be screened off with all the consequences and so forth. So I would like now to move on with the next one. And I would like to read, so because our Congolese colleague could not make it here, and she is actually a PhD in medicine and also in genetics. And so Koen, who just spoke, was actually her supervisor. And so she is an African young doctor. And so I will read what she has prepared. So she writes, in Africa, mystical beliefs still prevail on the origin of diseases. This is due to various factors, including at the medical side, lagging behind in the medical curricula, and lack of access to the often expensive diagnostic technologies such as imaging, biochemical, microbiological, and genetic tests. Likewise, therapeutic interventions are often limited due to inadequate infrastructure or expertise, but equally because a lack of a public health system. In the DR Congo, children with developmental disorders are subject to different forms of stigmatization and discrimination. Enfant sorcier, so a sorcery child, is a child considered to be a witch. The phenomenon of Mwana Kisimbi means a child who presents microcephaly irrespective of the cause, which can be multifactorial or after a central nervous system bleeding or infection. Mwanamai means a child with Down syndrome, presenting with upslanting palpebral fissures, hypotonia, and developmental delay. He is discriminated in the society. The phenomenon Sangha is a mystical belief that the child is sick because the father is unfaithful. There are widely held beliefs that a person with albinism is a sorcerer and represents bad luck. Moreover, he is thought to disappear at his death. Have you ever seen the remains of an albino? They are not human like us and never die. They disappear. They are nicknamed Kamzungu Nuso in certain tribes, which means a half-white. These beliefs result in lifelong discrimination of persons with albinism. When parents are confronted with a sick child, or a child who has a congenital anomaly or presents developmental delay, there is a high risk of parental divorce. In Malawi, the father accuses the mother or another member of her family to be the cause of the problem of their child. Likewise, the mother may accuse her husband or her stepfather or stepmother. All these beliefs prevent families to consult a medical doctor when they observe a developmental disorder in their child. They consult first a traditional healer and pastor to find a solution for the problem. Only afterwards, when no cure is provided, they seek help from a medical doctor. These beliefs hamper, therefore, the proper diagnostics and management of children with congenital anomalies, since they prevent timely referral. Moreover, mystical and traditional beliefs on the causes of disabilities and congenital anomalies often further hamper scientific progress. Now, I was actually able to film. I made a film about a number of Congolese people who actually were trained in Belgium. And I actually filmed her when she was doing a consultation with parents who had a child with developmental disabilities. And afterwards, she was telling me, I am trying to convey to the parents, certain information about the genetic information. And then in my clinical practice, I am trying to actually refer the parents, to services in sort of educational or other kinds of services. She says, however, in most cases, parents do not accept or find the information that they are receiving to be insufficient. They, so we could say that the cultural logic of transferring information about, the scientific, genetic reasons for developmental delays or often seen as insufficient for the parents to actually to move forward. So I'm now going to give the floor to Roel Feys, who is a philosopher, an ethicist, and the coordinator of the recently established Leuven Institute on Genetics and Society. So, Roel, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and also thank you so much for having me for this great roundtable discussion on a very important topic. What I would like to do is discuss some of my own recent experiences and also look more into the future. I think we have talked about Patrick's fieldwork, Koen's current experiences in the field. We've talked about the Congo and we've talked about Belgium, but as you may be able to hear from my accent, I have spent quite a bit of time in the United States, and I only recently moved back to Belgium. And I do think when we look at reproductive technologies in the United States that we see a big revolution development that is coming our way that still goes much further than current established practice in countries like Belgium, and that might, bring us much closer to eugenic practices. Two examples I want to highlight. One that has received quite a bit of news coverage is that last year, at the end of spring, beginning of summer, there were a couple of startup companies that announced that they would commercialize technologies allowing parents to run a genomic analysis on embryos pre-implantation to select embryos for complex traits. So the idea there is that, parents go to one such a company. I think Nucleus Genomics is one of them, Orchid is another one of them. You, of course, bring with you a large amount of money. I believe the price is, last time I checked, close to $10,000 for about 20 embryos to be assessed in this manner. And then those embryos will be ranked on the basis of certain traits. For example, predictions about height, eye color, but also intelligence, body mass index. And the idea is that you will pick your quote unquote best embryo. Now, as Koen knows much better than I do, there are incredible technical issues with these types of predictions about complex traits. And of course, there are also enormous ethical and social questions that arise. For example, and I think this is a concern within the new eugenics movement, where people say, look, if we are going to leave it up to parents to autonomously make decisions for their children, then this is well in their right to do so. And you see in places like Silicon Valley, places like New York City, where certain couples choose to go to these companies, have their embryos tested in order to, give their future kids purportedly or supposedly a advantaged future in life, because you will pick that embryo which is, again, the best, quote unquote. Of course, this raises important questions about reproductive autonomy, because on the one hand, we want to, be very clear about the importance of reproductive autonomy. Think, for example, about decisions about termination of pregnancy and the whole debate about that in the United States when Roe v. Wade was overruled or repealed by the Supreme Court. So, we have to acknowledge the value of reproductive autonomy and reaffirm the value of reproductive autonomy. But there's also, of course, the question, well, how far does reproductive autonomy reach? And do we really want parents to be able to make these types of decisions for their offspring? I mean, there's some very clear potential issues that arise. For one, you risk entering into the logic of a sort of genomics arms race, where parents will feel pressure to step to these companies to always use better, newer technology, so they can make sure that they have, in their mind, children that can, be competitive in the type of society that we have set up. So what does this do to parents feeling this pressure? And this is a pressure that parents already feel when it comes to tests like NIPT, that they, have to do the test. But this again takes this one step further. So I think that's a very important question. I just saw, by the way, and this is maybe interesting, when it comes to Nucleus Genomics, so one of these companies that offers these types of pre-implantation tests, they just announced that they expanded their services to Mexico. So this was a very big announcement. This is their first expansion outside of the United States. So they're also going to start offering their services there. And again, you know, this is a creeping process that seems to always move forward, and we don't take the time and the space to have a real societal debate about these technologies. And, you know, is this really where we want to be heading? Because, of course, this goes a step further still. In my previous role at the University of Miami, I was involved in a research program that looked at people's attitudes about prenatal genome editing. So the possibility to, in the not so distant future, treat embryos or babies while they are still in the womb to, you know, make sure they don't have, you detect a certain serious genetic condition, and then you are able, due to a gene therapy, to correct this condition even before the baby is born. Right now, they are experimenting with therapies that can be administered on neonatal children, so children that are weeks, months old. But there are also several teams that are working on the possibility of using these types of therapies prenatally. And here too, you have important questions about, you know, is this really where we want to be heading? I think on the one hand, we have to acknowledge, you know, when you think about cases like spinal muscular atrophy or some other very serious genetic conditions, I think, you know, the world won't be a worse place if we can, you know, get rid of these conditions. Most people would agree, even though, of course, there are many people, and we notice this also in discussions with patients who, you know, live with some of these conditions that would be considered pretty serious, but they say, look, I still have a certain, yes, I may be, say, wheelchair bound, but I have a certain quality of life. I find my life valuable, and, you know, I wouldn't want to, I can't imagine being any other way. This is who I am. This is my identity, and I wouldn't have used this therapy knowing what I now know. I don't think it's, you know, a given that I would want to use a therapy like this. But the issue, of course, is here too, you have this creep that enters. Yes, most people agree that this would be maybe a good idea for very serious genetic conditions. But what about other conditions that are less serious? There would be, for example, the possibility to deploy this for certain types of autism. Potentially here too, there are enormous technical barriers. But, you know, autism or neurodiversity, is this really something that we want to be treating for? Yes, there are certain people who have, you know, types of autism, and there's a spectrum that are so serious they can barely function. But there are other people who are very high functioning. So the question is, you know, if we have the means to, I guess, get rid of autism by treating people, so diagnosing them in the womb, treating them in the womb, is this something that we really want? And here too, the question, of course, is, you know, maybe we should stop and think and have a dialogue for a moment as a society to try and discuss if this is where we want to be headed. And we see that some countries are pretty far along in this. The Dutch, for example, have had DNA dialogues. They had big public consultations about how the public sees DNA, how they see DNA, genetic therapies. Other countries, not so much. For example, in Belgium, some of this has happened, but it's the debate isn't there. And I think that is very important as these technologies continue to develop. And as Koen pointed out, they are developing incredibly rapidly, that we do take the time and stop and think and talk about these developments, within different contexts. I think that is something that has become very clear so far, that if you look at Congo, Belgium, the United States, that people look and think about disability in different ways, about genetic technologies in different ways, and it's important to acknowledge this. And I'm going to leave it at that for now, Patrick.
Thank you so much, Roel. So I think importantly that you point out that this discussion about technologies raises a lot of issues, but more importantly that maybe we need a societal debate in terms of sort of going beyond certain ideas of in terms of what kind of world, what kind of society, what kind of human do we want, and that we really need a debate about that. So I think I'm going to give the floor now to Beatriz, and then we are going to open up the floor and have a conversation and dialogue about this.
Muchas gracias, Patrick. Y quiero también agradecer a quienes nos están acompañando, a Koen y a Roel, por lo que nos han compartido y también por la introducción que hizo Patrick. Yo quisiera aquí traer a colación el día de ayer que hicimos la presentación del libro para leer la eugenesia, pues justamente las discusiones
yesterday the conversations were revolving around well, in a superficial way, but they were revolving around the topics of eugenics that we've been discussing throughout the colloquium. The case that I presented of Fragile X syndrome and the existence of these genetic clusters. As far as I know, because of my personal research, there is a genetic cluster in Colombia, and there's another genetic cluster near Guadalajara in Mexico, and there's another genetic cluster in Indonesia, or a sort of genetic cluster in Denmark. But I want to go back to the presentations of today. I want to focus on this example of Ricaurte in Colombia. It's a small village where an Italian guy arrives. He founds a village around 1920, between 1920 and 1930. He founds or he creates this village. And he gets married with a woman, and both this woman and this guy, they had the Fragile X gene. Of course, I didn't know, but apparently, what happened is that, and maybe Koen might give us shed some light. They are called the founding gene because it's from this union of the creation of this village called Ricaurte. Families come over to this village, and a number of genetic encounters occur, and at some point 100 families were living in this place, and these families all had the Fragile X gene and of course the syndrome. So what happened during the 90s, around the year 2000, one of the near Ricaurte, there's another village, and a genetist was on vacation on this place that became also famous because of a novel that was written and then became a TV show in Colombia. He recalled, this geneticist recalled all these abnormal, so to speak, people in this village. And when he grows up and he becomes a geneticist, he says, well, I want to understand what's going on in this village. He conducts his studies and he meets this pediatrician that opened a research center in UC Babies, and along with her they created a genetic clinic in the village of Ricaurte. So the conversations that emerged within the investigations of this physician, of this doctor, are more focused on the medical realm and in correcting this apparent error of nature, rather than researching what was happening within this population and what is still happening within this population, what happens with the families, even with the people affected by disabilities because of the syndrome of the Fragile X. And he was focusing on eliminating the problem. So there's a whole campaign of assessment, diagnosis, and they offer sterilization, especially for women, in order to avoid bringing to the world children with a Fragile X gene or syndrome. In a recent interview with this person, he was happy to say, that was a couple of years ago, just one child was born with Fragile X syndrome, and he was really happy about it. So I was listening to Koen and Roel, and I also hear listening the presentation, the written presentation of Gerriye. This person from Republic of Congo, and it makes me wonder, or it makes me think in a couple of factors. On one hand, the need of humanizing genetics and medical sciences, because I think it's what Koen was telling us, humanizing science and humanizing medicine, but at the same time, it's maybe we could say it's a little bit naive to humanize science when we don't even know what's human on these current days. So maybe the question could be, if we really want to humanize science, genetics, maybe we should do what Patrick mentioned. Maybe we need to make a deep revision of what it means to be human in our current days. But this task also seems somehow, the way I'm proposing it, it's somehow naive. What you were mentioning here, what comes at play is, well, the individual beliefs of what it means to be human, the beliefs, the cultural beliefs, and also what the corporations and the market understand by humanity or human. I want to bring an example that it's apparently out of context, but it was so imprinted in my mind. I heard when Donald Trump sent Jared Kushner to Israel to check out all the negotiations with Palestine, and Kushner made this declaration that I found to be actually on point, because it opened pretty much, it shed light on what the Trump administration is about. He said, we identified that the problem is not historical. This is a business problem. Kushner says the Israel and Palestine problem is a business problem. Forget about history, and here the peace plans have failed because we have historians, politicians, when this is actually a business issue. It's a transactional problem. And when I hear Koen and Roel, how much the prenatal tests are now being part, but what's the percentage of people who actually accept to conduct these tests? And I think that also depends on many factors, but the factors that come to my mind, also thinking about this business point of view and connecting it with what Kushner said regarding the what was happening in between Israel and Palestine, the freedom of decision that we apparently have, that it's linked to this idea of human being that currently exists, especially for those in power. It's intervened by elements that have to do with the state, the government, the market, the bureaucracy, but also the corporations. So this reproductive autonomy Roel was mentioning, of course, I think we should think about it from where it is being promoted, from where this reproductive autonomy is being called out. Because we have countries such as Belgium. Koen was mentioning that 80% of the population might accept to conduct such testing, and they receive certain information. But if we go to, here in Mexico, if we go to the state of Mexico, in populations that barely have access to food, how could they possibly have access to such testing? And two, what kind of information they're going to receive? Because, okay, a geneticist, a doctor, or a physician in Belgium, it definitely has an influence in the way they convey, or you convey and understand information. But having this somehow contextual privilege also determines how we understand the type of human beings we are, or we want to be, the type of human being we want to have around ourselves. So I would like to go back to the example of this village of Ricaurte in Colombia. I heard an interview some months ago. There is a journalist interested in the Ricaurte case, and she brought to light this investigation about the village of Ricaurte, and she started interviewing families where women were sterilized, families where there were more than 4 children with disability, and where women specifically were sterilized. And she asked these women, young women, she asks, how is life now after being sterilized, knowing that your brothers and sisters had disability and that you could possibly bring to this world, not maybe, according to the genetic test, most probably they will bring to life children with disability. And it was interesting because the responses that these women gave were never taken into consideration by the geneticist team. They said they were sorry not being able to breed offspring. They were sorry they were not able to have children. And they were told that the suffering was not because of the disability, but the conditions of poverty they were living in. That maybe if they had had the possibilities of accessing better education, better healthcare, maybe they would not have accepted the sterilization. At least the women, 80% of the women who were sterilized. So there, I would like to state that this panel leaves us a lot of questions rather than certainties. We have, or now it raises questions about what strategies we should create, implement in this so-called plan or anti-eugenics plan, considering that these are strategies that come from the individual perspective, but also on the collective from the collective point of view, and these two are interacting. I would like to close this my participation telling you something that might appear to be like a dream or somehow dreamy, but I see this in the realm of tropical diseases. A couple of years ago, the Dr. David Alice, he was a physician who worked near Fauci in the United States, and he didn't like the management of Donald Trump during COVID, and he was wondering, what are we doing in the realm of global health? With whom who we are facing in terms of power, in terms of state power, and what are we doing as health workers? So there was a very personal path right there, and he finds this personal space, a Buddhist center in New Mexico. And he starts to study and go there, and he comes up with something that is not new for everyone. He realizes how the compassionate work within the area of health is it's important. So it's not just he was speaking about his personal journey, and he said, okay, we need to talk about compassion within the health realm, and his realm was tropical diseases, the unattended tropical diseases. So he started a pilot project in order to work in, I don't remember, but it was a country in Africa, to work with a group of nurses that were working with people affected by leprosy and other tropical diseases. And he was working the topic of compassion. But the work that is conducted there is way personal. And what happens there is this sort of rejection from a number of nurses towards the people affected by leprosy didn't have to do with leprosy itself. It was more about violence, the violence that came because of fear. They were afraid of dying. And this is something which emerges in the work with leprosy or Hansen disease. They were not afraid of becoming deformed. They were not afraid of becoming or getting that disease. They were more afraid of their fears came from this ideal of human, the ideal of a human who's healthy, who's not going to die, and if this person somehow dies, well, it will occur in an ideal situation. So this idea of humanizing science, medicine, genetics, I believe that it also should lead us to think on basic elements that we have forgotten. The human links, the social links are not truly discussed in areas such as genetics. these concepts that are already on the trash can, like compassion, solidarity, love. How do we materialize this in our daily work, in education, for example? So I would like to close by going back to the question Patrick mentioned. Where is this elephant? What about this elephant in the room? And considering what we've seen so far, you know, thinking about the concept of a human being, maybe that's the elephant in the room. What would mean, or how would that revisions should be conducted, and what would it mean to think on a human being or about a human being, or how can we think about a category of human beings where human beings are not the core? So far we have thought as human being as the central concept, forgetting the rest of the species, leaving the rest of the species behind. So how can we integrate all these forms of life as a new category? So I will leave my 2 cents there. Muchas gracias, Beatriz, por esta intervención tan apasionada, ¿no? Esta intervención tan importante. Nos ha
Works and how it doesn't work in the ways sometimes that we would like, in terms of compassion and empathy, love, solidarity, and so forth. And so you also mentioned about the problems that we have to look at in terms of power, the state, the market, the corporations, the technology, you know, that actually or sort of asking us new questions. And then you pointed out to, you know, to framing and reframing the problem. You know, your example of Kushner, you know, about Palestine, that we should not think about it in terms of history, but look at it in terms of a history, in terms of a business problem. And so the possibility to reframe the problem in a way is an interesting one. So it's interesting to see to what extent, you know, this would be possible. So thank you so much for this intervention, and I think we have now about half an hour that we can open up for discussions and questions, you know, coming from you, and to see to what extent we can actually deepen our understanding of what is going on, but at the same time also strategize in terms of, you know, what is it? How can we move forward? And I would like to remind you also at the very beginning of this colloquium that what I think Benjamin brought forward is to work with our own impossibility, but also to develop community, to develop new community as a way forward. So I will leave it at that, and I would like to, you know, to ask questions.
Sí, bueno, primero muchas gracias por a todos los participantes del panel, muy
First
interesante.
of all, thanks to all the participants of the panel. My question is an open question to any of the participants. Something that my students tell me in bioethics classes, what they usually ask me is if there's any ethical limit, or if we can establish ethical ways for the uses of reproductive technologies. And I'm speaking about the prenatal screening or gene editing, which was a topic on the previous panel. And because it seems that it's somehow easier to, when we think about extremes, okay, when we think about transhumanism, well, this definitely goes, well, apparently towards a perfectionism of humanity. But in real life, a lot of people we don't see those limits. We don't see the extremes. For example, Beatriz was mentioning, okay, people were afraid of death, but also they were afraid of suffering. My partner worked at Teleton, which is a hospital for children with disability. She worked with children with palsy, and the question for what mothers would say, if they have had access to screenings in order to know that their children were going to have palsy, they would have chosen to stop the pregnancy. They were not thinking about a perfect human. They were not thinking about eugenics or anything of this sort. They were just trying to avoid the suffering of their children. So I would like to know if you have any idea of how can we answer to this question. What's the limit? What's the ethical limit? And if it's something we can define.
Bueno, dos preguntas relacionadas.
A couple of questions related to freedom and humanism. I think that when we speak about freedom, I think about Isias Berling speaking about negative freedom. Have we reached the limits of freedom, the limits in the conception of freedom? And what happens when we think about this positive freedom? And talking about humanism since the beginning, Peter Sloterdijk comes to my mind with his essay of bringing or taking Heidegger. He gets rid of the conception of humanism and he ends up justifying eugenics itself, that we need to leave it behind just as we leave humanism behind. And here, bringing complexity to the conversation, in this deep question of how can we think of a new human. Thinking of new humans is thinking about new humanism. We need to rescue humanism, and related to that, the anthropocentric issue, because if we leave the humanity behind, maybe we can think in a positive way what Sloterdijk said instead of thinking of it in a negative way. Thanks a lot. I wrote down my question because I had a lot of questions, but just to cut to the chase, I would like to understand how from medicine can we dialogue with people with such diagnoses, to think about the risks of a contemporary eugenics, especially when the genetic screening faces cultural, colonial, as well as aging factors that cannot be thought of as prevented anomalies. And to connect it with the first question, how medicine can reflect about social suffering created by these conditions. Gracias a todos los participantes. Quisiera hablar sobre, bueno, algunos temas, ¿no? Con cierta
considering whether certain disability categories should be gotten rid of. I appreciate that there's often seen a hierarchy or spectrum of disability, and some are seen as more serious or having less
capacidades que a lo mejor no son tan serias.
I guess it just made me think, discomfort myself, not as a disabled person, but then also thinking, oh no, is there someone disabled we never, maybe in the room or online, like how do they receive this information. And in turn, extrapolating from that, thinking about, well, who is in the room, and not necessarily just this room, but in this conversation. And it's just so important that if we're going to be talking about elimination, that we firstly feel that we can ethically and morally say those things to the people who we're talking about, but secondly, that we're making sure those people are part of the conversation. And I thought specifically of Alice Wong, who is a leading US and international disability justice activist who recently died, who herself had muscular spinal atrophy, and they were so important in terms of advancing anti-eugenics debates and also activism around Palestine and so on, but also specifically did talk about the challenges of genetic testing and its eugenics roots. So I guess, just saying that I feel that in this particular forum it should be a space that is safe for anyone to be sitting in the room, and know that they won't necessarily be considered as someone whose a community could be possibly gotten rid of or eliminated. So thank you.
Okay.
Well, many thanks for this panel, and I'm also commenting on the earlier panel this morning, and I wanted to pick up on Patrick's reference to community, because he spoke about this a bit in a more of a kind of a private conversation, referring to the importance of community and community building in times like these. And I think the reasons are quite clear, but I think the depth of those reasons can lead us a bit further forward in trying to formulate responses to the massive and very, very challenging problems that we're facing. So my thoughts is about the possibility of building community very deliberately, in the sense of these 19th century and even earlier forms of building communities which entailed forms of reciprocal care before the existence of unions and before the existence of medical insurance and even of state-provided social services. So people, workers, trades, found a way of building alliances that allowed them to provide for various kinds of contingencies, health contingencies, or the whole range of things one faces in life. And my focus on this is trying to distinguish between the very large and general questions that we face in relation to technology, to ethics, to politics and economics and so on, which are so massive that they seem quite impossible to broach as a whole. In other words, the advance of technology is so savage, I would say, that it's actually, we know it's in a way unstoppable, and the question is, how do we find a way to place ourselves in relation to that very challenging again scenario. So what I'm envisaging is a very deliberate building of community, which is both a social and an economic alliance that allows for a discussion of criteria around, what this community thinks. It can be a transnational community, of course, how it decides on certain issues, what policies it takes, and for its size to allow for it to have a certain political weight in public affairs, but to not simply argue back in terms of, ideas or policy propositions, but actual practices. So the idea is to form a community which is large enough to follow certain principles and basically preach by example and not simply by discourse. And make decisions on all these very complex issues by pondering them and having a certain weight by virtue of its size, politically, and as a way of constructing a certain lobby, but also creating a kind of a Noah's Ark in a way for those who wish to join it. So this would be, at least to my mind, one way forward.
So I think I'm going to give the floor successively to all our panel members. And so maybe Koen, you can start, picking up on some of these questions and, giving your response or further thinking.
Okay, so thank you, Patrick. Thank you all for your very thoughtful ideas and comments. I would like to begin in one of the questions, asking the reflection about social suffering. And the way I understand it is what does it mean for a person and his family to have a disability, and how does this relate to freedom of choice or to reproductive autonomy? If we look at this from a daily life point of view, and this is often the way we do when we meet families in our clinic, they all or almost all voice their fear about costs of dealing with a child with a disability. Obviously, there is support from the government, but this is getting more and more difficult accessible for families. So this is something we have seen coming up over the last, I would say, 10 years. And before, this was not heard so often, but this is really one of the main concerns that parents voice nowadays. And this is a social aspect. I mean, as a society, is it a priority to take care of individuals with a disability and their families or not? And if not, this is really limiting freedom of choice and reproductive autonomy. This is really influencing the choice people have. And ultimately, this could explain why there is such a high take-up of Down syndrome screening in pregnancy in our country. A second aspect is, in a society where there is not much debate, so people who actually have a child with genetic disorder, death, in theory, or at least by the available technology, could have been, between brackets, prevented. How are these parents looked upon? How they are perceived? how does society accept this? Yeah. Again, I think that often this is perceived as negative, and again puts a very high burden on the freedom of choice people have in dealing with genetic risks and reproductive autonomy. So I think this is some of the ideas I wanted to voice about this.
Okay, thank you. Maybe Koen? I mean Roel, sorry.
Yeah, a couple of things that struck me. First of all, there was this idea of a perfect child. A while back, I had a conversation with Gerriye Schneiwijs, who is a neurogeneticist, but also the head of the INSERM ethics committee. And one thing that he said really struck me. It was parents don't want the perfect child, they want the healthy child. And of course, then the question is, well, what is a healthy child? And I think there too, we have to acknowledge that we have to really think of that very broadly. We see that from conversations with parents who have children who have certain disabilities, that they are very, able to, even things like they learn sign language, they invest all this time, all of this energy in their children, they find their relationship with their children valuable, and to them, their child is, a child like any other child. And I think that goes back to another remark that was made about being very careful about, getting rid of certain people. And I think that's something we absolutely need to be very, very careful about. When I was talking about this earlier, I was primarily thinking about, say, diseases like Tay-Sachs, maybe SMA type 0, very terrible diseases that are incredibly debilitating and result in, children dying within a matter of years. Outside of these, where, I think most people would agree, yes, this is worthwhile to do something about this if we can. I think we need to be incredibly reluctant and careful about how we go about this idea of getting rid of people, because this can be incredibly stigmatizing. We need to enter into a dialogue, a broad dialogue that of course also includes people who have this lived experience, and who from that lived experience, and again, as I mentioned earlier, often they say, look, I have a high quality of life. I live my life. This is me. And I couldn't imagine it any differently, nor would I want to. And I think that's very important to have this realization, and that we don't start making decisions for others based on certain assumptions. So those are just a couple of things. And there was a lot in these remarks that I thought were very interesting, very rich. Also, the remark about community, I really liked it. I thought it was a very important important way to I guess, enter into this, or to strategize without immediately entering into a discourse that often becomes a yes/no type of situation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Maybe you still want to add something?
Me gustaría solo Pues
I would like to thank Linda for bringing, well, for the comments she made. My thoughts go to the connection of what was mentioned regarding fear of suffering. And I think about, or it makes me think about a couple of things. One is that on one hand is urgent, it's necessary to acknowledge, just as Linda mentioned, something that you find. For example, I, as a sister of brothers with disabilities, reading the reports that births of children with fragile eggs are decreasing, it makes me wonder. It's the question of one of my brothers. I was trying to explain him all the scientific element, and he told me, so there won't be people like us anymore. And I was struck by that question coming from my brother, because it made me, because for him it's like, okay, what does it mean for him, people like me? So here we have a contradiction, this ambivalence of, okay, on one hand is, okay, we don't want to avoid this suffering. And yes, 90% has to do with the life conditions, the lack of support from the state, governments that don't work. But the other 10% has to do with real physical suffering. I always remember Alex de Jong, he's a blind photographer from Holland. And I invited my students in Holland, and my students were asking him how did he took pictures if he was blind. And some student asked him, he's a Buddhist also, would you like to see again? And he said, I hate to be blind, and I give anything, I would do anything, any measure, any technological measure to see. I want to see again. And when I hear this person, when I hear Tom Shakespeare to say, I'm in favor of the screening to avoid the suffering of people with disabilities, I also think about the diversity of disability, the diversity of opinions within the realm of disabilities. Some disabled people find brutal the idea of screenings, of prenatal screenings, but there are others who are in favor. So it's acknowledging that disability is not an homogeneous group, that sensitivities are different. That on one hand. And on the other hand, I think about this fear of suffering, this fear of death. It's a natural human fear, whether you're disabled or not, but disability, chronic diseases, lethal diseases are constantly reminding us the fragility of the body. And I think that's what we are trying to stop. That's why we are looking forward to get rid, so to speak, of disability. We want to get rid of diseases because they reminds us that our body is finite. That is, it's going to die at some point. It's maybe kind of idealistic, but in my personal work, in order to face suffering, death, and all these fears, I think it's essential to recognize those fears. We cannot work with other peoples, with disabled people, if we do not conduct our own personal work. I think about Joan Colfax. She's now a Buddhist teacher. She says that there's no political work without an internal work, that one thing goes hand in hand with the other. So, well, this will be my intervention. Muchas gracias. Yo quisiera agregar un par.
Few things to add. In terms of the first question, are there ethical limits? And I think it's interesting to sort of look at, at societies. For example, Belgian society has really gone through a number of conversations about suffering, about sexual abuse, and to see, to what extent reparations and repair can exist, and to what extent, how far do we need to go as a society? And it's an ongoing conversation. And I think it's interesting to see, where are the limits? Where are the limits in terms of, in terms of forgetting and forgiving of certain trespasses that have happened. So I think we have to look at this. I would also want to mention in terms of crossing boundaries. For example, one of the biggest discussions that we had in Belgium was about transgender in terms of, we had discussions about gender, many, and so one of the very last ones is transgender. And I'm also thinking that it's interesting to take very particular cases. So, for example, I was teaching sometimes in my class and said, let's take a certain case. For example, let's take Michael Jackson. Okay, Michael Jackson, was it a child or an adult? He was playing between the two. Was he male or female? Was he black or white? To what extent, he was into plastic surgery and changing his body and so forth. Okay, so I think we could sort of look at that as a person that is sort of at the vanguard of society in terms of what is possible to do. And at a certain time, then there was a scandal in terms of, his being involved with children. And then we said, no. So I think, we reach ethical limits. We can go very far in terms of, transgressing borders and so forth. But at a certain time, I think we reach the limits. And so the second question was also about reaching the limits of our freedom, which I think is a very interesting one. And the person was saying that maybe we need to leave humanism altogether behind us, or we need to develop a sort of new humanism, and how should that look like? So I think those are very interesting discussions. I'm going to close with what Benjamin was mentioning about community, and that we have deliberately we need to look for developing new types of community. I think it's already happening, but I once followed a sociologist. I forgot his name, but he wrote a book, Bowling Alone, and he was basically saying that a number of organizations, community organizations, like for example bowling, or playing cards together, or playing with pigeons, or all kinds of things. And he was situating, he said, these new forms of community and of sports and so forth were formed at the beginning of industrialization, sort of when societies were really going through a transformation. And so I think we're going through this transformation again, and I'm hopeful, and I think it's already happening in terms of deliberately developing new types of community. politically, economically, in terms of sustainable, taking care of each other, taking care of the planet, and so forth. I think it's already happening. And so I think maybe we should sort of try to build onto that. So I'm going to leave it with that. Thank you all very much for being in the session.
Patrick, there is one question, and maybe we can do as Catherine did yesterday, like to leave the question open, and then we can discuss.
Yeah, I'd love to sort of to float the question. So I've been listening to the panels this morning, and it reminds me that one of the dangers of eugenics is that it lures us into worlds of abstraction, right? One of the earlier panelists talked about looking at an individual, or I would say a group of people, through a microscope. And if you're looking so narrowly, you're not looking at the context in which people are situated. And so we move from an understanding or appreciation of diversity to definitions of anomaly and then eventually pathology. And so as we think about these genetic technologies and connecting with the earlier theme of violence, eliminationism is a form of violence. Do we even know what, I mean, I think you made the point earlier, we don't even know what human is still. And so as we begin to think about perfecting humans, are we damaging our capacity to become fully human by eliminating the very things that reflect our diversity? And so much of that is rooted in the dehumanization of the voices that are being subordinated in the first place. And so there's many examples that we can look to that are happening right now where the retrieval of indigenous knowledge is helping us to repair landscapes on a scale level. Knowledge that was present, that was dismissed or thought to be superstitious or whatever. You know, I think about, excuse me, during the pandemic, at least in the United States, we had the highest level of employment of disabled people because we changed the model of how business was done. We brought the technologies to people, they were able to make their contributions. You know, as Linda said, you know, Alice Wong made tremendous contributions to society. She was not a pathology, she was a human being making contributions. So as we think about this notion of community building forward as an antidote to this eliminationist ideology, I think it's important to remind ourselves what's outside of the scope of investigation, because I think those are the very things we need to be paying attention to, rather than the narratives that are telling us or reinforcing this notion that they don't have value in the first place. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Entonces nos vemos a las 3:30, ¿verdad? Por favor, no se olviden de dejar los aparatitos de la traducción afuera antes de salir. Gracias. Y muchas gracias a nuestros, a Roel y también a Koen. Thank you so much.